You're tuned in to RX Radio.
This is kind of full circle. Remember that episode we did with Quinn Hannock where you held the microphone for like 2 straight hours?
Well, yeah, I'm trying to make it look aesthetically like, and I can't see my full frame, but I want people to believe that this is attached to something. It's not. It's just sitting on my lap. But yeah, professionalism has really, let's say production quality. Production quality has been on the come up.
Yeah, for
call
sure.
it can you use the word precipitous if it's an increase?
I don't really even know what that word means. So,
well, like I think precipitation, like rain. I think precipitous would only go with decline.
Okay, all right, it
right?
makes sense.
Like that kind of
decline.
Yeah, but like precipitous, like it doesn't rain upwards, at least on this planet that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wanted to use the words precipitous incline, but I don't think those two go together because it doesn't rain upwards.
Well, yeah,
which actually, believe it or not, has a lot to do with the topic today. Because full disclosure, we never know what we're going to talk about. So one thing we thought, well, let's just talk about shit we've already talked about, and people just probably haven't heard. So it literally went back and scrolled through podcast episodes, and we're like, well, what have we talked about in the past that maybe only like 17 people listen to us talk to? And so we just went back and started scrolling to early episodes. And I think one that comes to mind, and it actually tangentially ties into our little rant there about the word precipitous, is like, defining terms and in such a way that it dictates how we move as a consequence of the terms, right? So like mobility and stability and strength, trademark. Yes. I'm almost, have you ever like put up something on the internet and the fact that you put it up pushes you away from doing it? You're like, I don't want to be typecast as that guy. I haven't had a kettlebell in my hand since Nom. Because everyone's like bottom under press, and they like, it's like, stop. Like, I'm glad it's out there now, and I'm glad stability is a conversation that's being had. But like, I don't want to talk about it because I've been talking about it until everyone started talking about it. And then I'm like, all right, I'm gonna like go lift weights now because we got to like even the scales here.
Well, that's a really good point, because what we don't get on the internet, especially on Instagram, is context around this stuff. Is right, how much is it weighted? Right? Like even mobility, stability, and strength. Yes, all of these things are important, but they're not equally important in terms of implementation of how are we going to introduce these things into our workout. I don't want to spend a proportionate amount of time on a foam roller that I do back squatting, or doing a bottoms under press that I do bench pressing, or whatever it's going to be. And I think that's the thing, is that people latch onto these things that may be lacking in maybe their exercise program, or they find something that it really resonated with them, or it was very helpful for them at a specific time, and they think this is the fucking thing. Like, this thing is the shit. But it's really just a small piece of the puzzle that you were missing, as opposed to looking at the whole picture and understanding where it fits into that. And I think that's where a lot of this stuff gets kind of bastardized, and it gets taken out of context, and that's why people are, all gung-ho on bottoms under presses, or hip airplanes was the big one. Everyone did every variation.
I'm so sorry.
I know, man.
It's almost like my drug dealer.
Please elaborate.
Well, yeah, I figured I get my shrooms off this guy in South Beach, and he's the funniest dude in the world. He's like he's a shaman. Now, shamans are probably about as well regulated an industry as online coaches, if I'm being 100% honest.
Yep, sounds about right.
So, periodically when I indulge, I go to my boy's place in South Beach, and it's like, imagine Pineapple Express, but in Miami, and not weed, but mushrooms. It's that exchange of like, at some point someone's going to throw up on a printer. Like, that's pretty much how this goes down.
Oh, fuck.
But why the fuck are we talking about shamans? So maybe the drugs are too good.
Mushrooms, context, Instagram.
Okay, so he describes his interaction with source, which is amazing. Like, this guy will just melt. Like, he'll take so many drugs. Like, it's insane what the human brain is capable of withstanding or not withstanding. But every time he like hops in the whip and we do the little like pre-drug deal exchange, he has some sort of anecdote about source. Are you familiar? Have you heard of source?
I've heard the word. I have no idea how you're referring to it, what it means.
So according to him, there's like, and I've had this exchange with other people who dip in nefarious drug use, but it's like, it's like the ego death, that whatever that state is when people are like really gung-ho into drugs. And it's like, I maintain drugs should be fun. So that's like PSA. We're not sitting here to go and get a shaman or do anything like that. Do whatever the fuck you want. But I think of that as like, and the thing I like about him, he's super interesting dude. And we might get him on the podcast at one point. He's fucking wild.
That's amazing.
He can get to source now without drugs. So like he can like meditate and go to like the dimension where we don't exist. Like he's I mean, and here's the thing, always a caveat. It's like, it could all just be a side effects of drugs. Like, let's not
brain
ever
damage is what you're saying.
discount. Yeah. Let's not ever discount that drugs definitely work. But it's like, and that's something that interests me is like, he'll go a long time or he'll go a duration of time without being on these drugs. But because he's like, okay, he got there with drugs. Now he knows how to get to whatever that mind state is or whatever it is. I don't think it's like a physical location, but he can do it without drugs. And listening to him describe how he does it without drugs is super interesting. It's like, I think of that in this context of being like, okay, source for us is like pain-free progressive movement, right? Yeah. That's our source. And that's what we want to get back to. And there are things that we can use to get us back to source, but the goal is to get to source. The goal is, and he will explain in fucking crazy drugged out detail interactions at 10 dimensions. I'm like, dog, I'm still working on like 3, maybe 4. You telling me there's 10? And so he'll talk about like what happens it's like reading Dante's Inferno, if anyone's ever read the book. And I know we're bouncing around in a lot of, Italian literature to drug dealers in South Beach to exercise. But if you could follow the vein of thought, it's like his whole idea is he can move through these different dimensions on his own now, but like he knows how to get to source. And I feel like when we talk about like mobility implementation, stability implementation, there are places just on the roadmap to movement source, pain-free, progressive, overstimulating movement that allows us to move towards whatever objective outcome we're looking for. And I think, I do as little stability work as probably anyone. Now it's like unilateral Bulgarian split squats or, dumbbell overhead press or like, less stable mediums in less stable positions, but I still try to drive output, right? The idea of these, it's almost like it's again, stability is just, it's always a present factor in our training, right? And like we go into this in detail in the level 1 course about just being able to scale stability. And I think ultimately it's one of the most underutilized lifting constraints to keep subjective intensity high while allowing objective load to be managed, right? Yeah. So it's like, if I want to minimize how much someone can lift, I'm not just going to tell them to do something light. And I think a cornerstone of the level 1 course is like almost a death to that sentiment. Because I know so many trainers, and I've said this to people in the past, like, oh, we're just going to go light today. Right. You feel onerous. And this is getting worse with the I don't want to say worse because of something, but it's becoming worse with the rise of auto regulation as a subset within auto regulation should be exacted through exercise selection. That's like my sound. J Marsh, yellow text, Instagram right there. We're going to do the whole thing. We're going to clip it up and add this little diatribe about how this is now from a podcast and Instagram, because that's how the internet works. But I think auto-regulation should mean for general population, regulation of exercise selection based off of loadability. And loadability, one of the biggest constraints of it is the underlying, and it's not fucking Santa Claus. It's not the Easter Bunny. It still exists whether you believe it or not, right? So I think that's a big foundational component is like, how loadable is this exercise based off of either A, how skilled am I at the movement, AKA how much internal stability can I meet the external environment with, and exact a challenge on a muscle while co-contracting a bunch of other muscles, or how externally stable is the environment so I can leverage my internal stability maximally to challenge muscles, because both are big factors, like, internal stability on externally supported machines. So what does that mean? It means from an ability to create muscular co-contraction while simultaneously training like an agonist muscle group is a cornerstone criteria of external environments that are unstable. So like a bent over barbell row is a classic example. If we look at a bent over barbell row, it's like, do people consider it not a good exercise in the hypertrophy world because of all that co-contraction? But I say, like, that activity from the brain that creates that co-contraction is going to be the long-term future proofing of your ability to converge that co-contraction, converge that divergent signal of muscular contraction to all parts of the body other than the thing you're trying to directly work. When you go from bent over barbell row and can coordinate that movement, you take that ability to internally resist force in certain places while exerting force in others. If you then take that and channel it into an externally supported environment, your output's going to be through the roof, right? So I think that's the piece that's missing, especially in hypertrophy, because I feel as if hypertrophy is looked at devoid of looking at the brain. I feel like it's people are pressed up too close to the glass. Again? No, but it could. We could always say, okay, if Will has taught me one thing, don't worry, his name's not actually Will. It's that, you can get to source many ways. So it's like, I just feel like people don't consider the role of the brain in hypertrophy. And I definitely ascribe to a central processing model that, the majority of our function is going to tie back into the central nervous system. That's sort of the hierarchy of movement. And that carries the throne in the hierarchy of movement and stimulus adaptation. So I think when we look too closely at, people who discount the external environment as the demand on the internal environment, or how the external environment puts a demand on the internal environment, and negate stability as a worthwhile long-term endeavor to hypertrophy, are ultimately putting a hard stop on their ability to recruit and stimulate and adapt tissue with that stimulus in mind.
Yeah. I have so many things I want to say right now, but I think the big thing is that coming back to the central nervous system and being able to adapt to the stimulus that we're eliciting or that we're introducing, is my mindset has come so full circle on this over the past, when was our first podcast? January
2017. Yeah.
So since then it's come so full circle, and it's exactly what you said about like the bottoms on the press, is that this thing gets put out there. Everyone like says this thing and I'm like, fuck that thing. I don't want to hear that thing anymore. But we kind of founded this company on that tagline that we now have trademarked: mobility, stability, strength. Right? And there's an order to that, and it's not an accident that it's in that order. And I think the big thing that I've noticed, or that I find myself coming back to over time, is that there was this kind of industry push. It started out mobility, supple leopard, like early 2010s. Like then it's banded distractions, foam rollers, lacrosse balls. And then it moved maybe towards like the late 2010s to stability, right? A lot of the stuff that we talk about and we started to preach, and people started to understand that it's not just being able to get into these positions. It's actually being able to control these positions and resist force through end range that's going to allow you to hold on to that mobility that you have, or that range of motion that you have. And then it all kind of comes back to just training to be strong, because no one just wants to be stable. That's dumb. Being strong, it should be the goal. Being more capable over time is maybe a more general way to say it. So as we start to look at this, I think the context that everyone misses, or that was missed in each of these phases, where it's a big push towards mobility, a big push towards stability, or there's always been just like the old school people that say, just get strong, fuck all that shit. But the context is that these things all are always interplaying with each other. Right? There's always some component of each that's necessary for us to be successful in having progress and being pain-free and getting to source, right? And it's not a linear process, is the thing with that. So the way that I think about this is it's a checklist, and it's assessment every single time you walk in the gym. And some people are going to start off a big principle of the prescript level 1 is indexing, right? There's kind of this index of passive to active, right? And not even just active, but loadable, a scale of loadability. So the more passive things are going to they're going to elicit kind of more transient changes, things that are going to give us a very short-term effect that's not going to be long last. And even with the summation effect, it's not going to cause much progress. Versus the more active these things are, then that's going to be something that's a little bit longer standing change, but it's not necessarily going to give us progress past a certain point unless it is on that loadability spectrum, right? Is we need, and the way that I think of every single thing that we do in the gym is this an adaptable stimulus, right? Or what is the adaptation that we can elicit from the stimulus? And if that's on a shorter compressed time frame, like if we think that this person's having a hard time getting their hand overhead because of tension through the lats, then we can tap into the nervous system through breathing and foam rolling to get a very short-term adaptable stimulus that we can now allow them to get their hand over their head. Okay, if we do that every single day, is that going to necessarily allow them to get their hand over their head any easier over time? Not really, because it's a very short-term adaptation that we're not allowing them to build upon. So that's why this process becomes important, is because if we now start to tap into the nervous system through another way and we say, okay, we allow them to move in this way and their hands over their head, now can we get them to resist force in that plane of movement? So that, okay, we now have created this short-term adaptable stimulus of getting their hand over their head. Now we can have something that's a little bit longer lasting, is that maybe it's the kettlebell bottoms under press, and they're getting through that. They're expressing their ability to resist force through scapulothoracic joint, through the glenohumeral joint, into that full shoulder flexion external rotation. If we have them continue to do that over time, then yes, the summation of that stimulus will probably allow them to get into that position more often with more ease. But they're not them inherently doing that isn't going to make them any better at producing force, or it's not going to make them any stronger. So we need that last piece of this, which is going to kind of solidify the process, is that once we actually get them on that loadability spectrum, is that that's when we don't necessarily have to do this shit anymore, right? There's a lot of front end work to get them to get their arm over their head, to get them to understand how to create stability through, to use one of your references, their valences of, diaphragm, scapulothoracic, glenohumeral joint. And then once they understand that, then we can just fucking load it. We don't have to spend as much time getting them to build awareness around these positions or getting these shorter term, less adaptable stimuli. And we just have this one very present, very adaptable stimulus that's infinitely scalable, is just loaded. And the thing that makes me feel full circle, or that I've come full circle on, is that once we get here, we don't necessarily stay here. Is sometimes we need to touch back on those earlier indexes. And that's constant assessment, right? Is that we're going through this phase or these processes of checking in. Is that you and I, we've been in the gym for 2 decades now, right? And it's not like I don't touch a foam roller or a lacrosse ball, or I don't do any static stretching anymore. It's that I do that stuff with the understanding that, okay, I feel like shit today, or I feel off today. I want to gain an understanding of where my range of motion is in this general region at this specific time. And then I want to have some sort of intervention around that, because I know I can do the end of index thing. I know I can do this, but there might be things inhibiting me from doing that well. So that's kind of the process that makes this full circle, is that we need to come back and we need to touch on those things, and we need to go through that process. But once we get into that loadability spectrum, is that we spend a lot less time over here. Is that I might do a static stretch just to see where I'm at. I might foam roll my glute. I might do a couple hip airplanes, and then I'm lunging or I'm squatting or whatever it might be, just to make sure that I can get into the positions that are necessary to be able to load that range of motion.
So many of the words you chose are so directly correlative to the point that I'm trying to make, is like, you use the word feel a lot. And I think in the weightlifting world, it's gone so retarded that it's just people, and don't, stay with me, is people equate feel to emotions, not feel to sensations. Right. So people equate feel to emotions, not feel to sensations. And it's like, there's a fundamental difference between the two, to a degree. Like it's hard to discern out, like once input hits the frontal cortex, like look out, like there's a whole bunch of shit that we can't really predict there. That's like our thinking cap. But when you said, check in on how you feel, it's not like going to your therapist, right? It's looking at, okay, what can I perceive sensory at these different levels, at the scapulothoracic joint, at the glenohumeral joint, at the rib cage, at the level of the diaphragm, your psoas, what can you feel? What are you aware of? And so I think that's where people get tripped up, is like they hear the word feel and they think emotions. It's like, no, think sensations, right? And this is where, this is a hill I'm willing to die on, is muscles are sensory organs there was this push for a long time that muscles were dumb. And it's like, muscles are literally the conduit into the nervous system. So like, good luck with that. And because it does tie into, hierarchically, it ties into the brain. And the muscles are the conduit to create this motion capture, to allow us to know where we are in space. And the accuracy of that comes from the sensitivity, not sensitivity from a feel standpoint. It's not like Bridget Jones's Diary, a bottle of Merlot, and you're crying your fucking eyes out. It's like literally the sensitivity in the way that a radar would be sensitive, right? That it's like if you had some, military base somewhere, you'd have a very sensitive radar that perceives a difference. And that's where you're at. And that's the touching of like a full circle. It's like you put, 300-400 pounds like over your head. It's like you are going to be sensitive to a change that is different than the environment that was conducive to do that thing. And sensitivity only comes from being well established at the further end of strength development, right? Like sensitivity around mobility and stability is only made possible by being able to exert force, by putting a current through that sensation, through that framework, through that microchip, through that configuration of all these sensory inputs in series. Then when we turn the lights on, right? Then we put some load through it. So I think there's a big misconception when we look at feeling something. And like, in hypertrophy camps, people talk about mind muscle connection and all that, which is fine. And then there's people who are more like stimulation based, but the people who make the argument, and, stimulation and sensation are different. But I think a good coach and good proprioception and good, exercise progression in meeting someone where they're at, understanding that yes, muscles are sensory organs, that if we can align sensation and stimulation together, then that feel is going to be a direct proxy to the exercise that they're choosing. And that if they don't feel it, they're actually in a position where they're not stimulating it. Right? I think that's a mark of a good coach, is putting people in positions where sensation and stimulation are the same. Right. So we can begin to tie these sensory awarenesses to the efficacy of the stimulation. Right. And a lot of people are like, well, I'll just move it A to B. The muscle had to move it. It's like, well, there's a lot that goes into feeling movement. It's not necessarily just the level of the muscle. Right. And we dive into this in the L1 and L2. It's like, how do we perceive feeling of movement? And it's nothing, and people just glass over this, because they're so ungrateful that this evolution has occurred. But it's like, take a look under the hood, man. This is insane. It's like, well, yeah, we have these, these joint capsules. We have these these proprioceptors, which is like talking more directly to like the mobility and stability side of things. Then we have mechanoreceptors, right? If you haven't had your shoulder over your head in a long time, the skin around your shoulder hasn't stretched in a way that you'd perceive where your shoulder is over your head. So maybe what you need to feel is just that again. Like we look at common therapeutic modalities like KT tape or Graston or cupping. It's like, it's probably just stretching the skin. Probably has nothing to do with blood flow. Not nothing to do with blood flow because of the interconnectivity of all these things. But there are only so many fundamental units of sensation that we have. Like an interesting thing to perceive is, I'll look at it this way. Maybe here's a good comparison. Sensations that we can identify are like hex codes. So if we think of like a hex code, like sending a color code to a designer or something online, and it's like, I don't know, 6 digits, usually in front of a hash or after a hashtag. There's only so many free nerve endings that provide us with direct stimulus or direct, what am I trying to say? So hex codes are these like 6-digit numbers, maybe they're longer, I don't really know, that identify the property of a color as based off of what that color is made up of, like from the primary color perspective. Right. And then, but feeling and sensation is very similar. And well, let me clarify and say sensation is very similar, where we only have free nerve endings that, like, I don't know, maybe lateral spinothalamic tract will handle some heat. And then we have vibration, skin stretch, deep pressure, light touch. I think that's about it, right? From a mechanoreceptor standpoint. Then internally at the level of the muscle, we have proprioception, and proprioception breaks down into joint capsules, muscle spindles, and Golgi tendon organs. But like, if we think about it at a sensory level, and this is an abstract thought, we don't have like a sensory perception for like when something is wet. There's not a nerve that goes, this is the wet nerve. The water triggered the wet nerve. The wet nerve is like when I have a puppy right now, and when I step and piss in my house, it's not like there's a nerve in my foot that goes, oh, that was wetness. I know it because it's a hex code of the core primary senses that we have mechanistically in our skin, which are going to be light pressure, deep pressure, or light touch, deep pressure, vibration, and skin stretch. So like when I step in Banks's piss, what I'm actually stepping into is a combination hex code of the presence of those four things. Right. I have programmed that and associated that over almost 33 years to understand that that's what something wet feels like. My brain doesn't have a direct line to the wetness center of my brain. It's just like, I don't know, you have a somatosensory cortex and you have this hex code, and that's, we can categorize that over time, and eyesight has a lot to do with it, like visual inputs, especially being animals, like other than fucking snow owls or peregrine falcons. We're very visually acute animals. So we have that ability to see something and then take that hex code sensory peripheral input and then classify it as as we classify, right? That's wet because it's, don't step there. That's wet. And if we all would likely have a similar sensation, and kind of tying back to what you were talking about, it's like, checking in on those sensations a lot of times ends up looking a lot like load management. Which is like, hey, I'm going to like move from, a back squat to a front squat. Front squat's less stable of a movement. Your center of mass is deviating over your base support. Your base support's limited. You have less structural support. But, and again, this is how you acid test your system or your model is, can you arrive at similar conclusions to other models? And it's like, in this case, absolutely. So what we kind of teach in the level 1 is like, building a reproducible model that logically finds conclusions similar to that of other models that are proven to work, right? And I think that's where people like lose the plot in this type of world, is like they think that they need to build an educational model that varies the end result. It's like, right, that's not a good idea, right? Like we know how people get big and strong. Now, there are subtle permutations within each model that will, and the end result will be slightly different, but the end goal is always the same with all models that work. It's like find source, right? That is the ultimate goal. It's like how we, the way we talk about it is hopefully a slightly more expedient way to find source for a client, because we can stratify and almost like chronologically order stimuli in order of least complex to most complex, or fastest adaptation to slowest adaptation. Mm-hmm. And if you look at it, like, you worded it so well, it's like transient, like, yeah, mobility is very transient, right? Flexibility is very transient. And I would put flexibility ahead of mobility, before stability, before strength. Stability is, it's not as transient, but it also takes longer to adapt to, right? The idea, like the single leg analogy goes around a lot. And the idea is, hey, I just want to, on one leg, to be able to control my center of mass over my base of support, because that ability to co-contract fast will allow me to stay in better positions when I'm trying to put tension through glutes, tension through hamstrings, tension through quads in any setting, right? Whether that's unilateral or single leg or bilateral, 2 legs, whether it's leg press or whether it's squat, that will allow me to drive into the next phase. So it's like here, mobility is fleeting. Almost, fleeting, transient, quick, here and there, gone, like just like the wind. Stability, less so, and then strength, less so, right? But like, look how long, the longer they take to build, the less time they take to, to maintain. For example, like I can feel tight. We flying around all the time, sleeping on different beds. Just having to be in Edmonton causes me enough anxiety that my body just fucking cringes. Yeah. So it's like, all right, well, that feeling is as transient as the stimulus I need to no longer feel that feeling.
Right. Yeah.
I can stretch and not feel tight. Right. But like with strength, for example, strength takes a long time to build, but like you're a classic example of this. You're lifting heavier weights than you've ever touched in your life, and you're training the least amount. Right. So it's like you put in the work, so you can tap in. And stability is kind of this there's a Goldilocks and the Three Bears middle adaptation, where if you understand how to wield it, if you really understand its base components, it's not that difficult. It's just a way to, have a system of decision making that allows you to make better decisions faster. And that's really what being a good coach and being a good trainer or therapist or strength coach or whatever, that's your job, is to make better decisions faster. And I think, the L1, we talk about systems building, like building a systems way of thinking so that you can act, right? Like and it's cool. Like I love being on the gym floor now, and every day you get more confident, especially and that's a proving ground. Like I think working in person with people is the biggest flex. Like, everyone wants online stuff and they want their fucking Lambos and their passive income. Like there's nothing better than watching a well-run session, whether it's one person, whether it's 10 people, like, because you're like fucking Spider-Man, like you're just slow. Everything slows down and you can make decisions so fast that it's seamless. Your communication becomes better. And I think that's something like when we talk about off the cuff, like, look, if you read the research, anywhere between 70 to 93% of communication is nonverbal, which means, hey, that potential 7% is really important, right? The words that you choose, and if you aren't caught up in figuring out like, oh, what exercise do I do? That one's taken, that machine's taken. Oh, it's 5 o'clock. If you're not caught up in that, you can just make better decisions faster, which is your job. That's the goal of all this. Then you can communicate with your clients better. And that 7% is golden. That's the 7% that we have to communicate. And the 93% of nonverbal communication is that much clearer because you've made a decision quicker. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for the confidence in the ability for you to take action fast. That's across the board in anything, whether it's training, whether it's relationships, whether it's anyone. That's how you build trust, is like having the confidence and conviction to being like, this way, right? And just like because what you've done is you've accepted the responsibility of being wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what people want.
Mm-hmm. I've been getting a lot of foot questions lately.
Oh, Jesus. I'm not wearing shoes.
And
we're not doing that.
The thing is, no, we're not doing the foot thing. No more feet on videos.
Dude, hashtag gay foot slave will haunt me for the rest of my life.
Oh, my God, dude. Yeah.
They posted that. That's out there. Jay Marsh will get you the clip.
My God, I hope it's not out there anymore. That's against the community guidelines for sure.
Yeah. Anyway. Well, what the fuck? Anyways, carry on.
Anyways, yeah. The reason I bring this up is there's a lot of foot people on the internet, and it just keeps getting weirder.
Not foot slave foot people.
Yeah,
like people who are interested in the mechanics of feet.
Right. Yes. And there's merit to that, right? People go in, they go deep on that, and they can describe the mechanics of a foot very well and the implications of different movement or foot strike or whatever that might be, and how that radiates upstream, downstream, or however that affects whatever this person is feeling. But I think it comes back to kind of like you were saying, and peeling away all the nonsense stuff here and getting to the base principles that lie underneath this stuff, right? I had a conversation with someone the other day about foot stuff. This person talked to a foot person, and they had all this terminology that I had never heard of before, like all these acronyms and all these things and these names for specific movement patterns that I'm unfamiliar with. And I've been around a bit. I've heard people talk about feet and biomechanics and all that stuff. I'm like, listen, I have no fucking idea what you're saying. But let's break this down from those base principles that we talked about that, the level one's highly based off of is center mass basis support. Let's start there. And let's start to look at your biomechanics starting from the pelvis and radiating outward, and how that might have similar implications of what this person is saying is happening from your foot with these words that I don't know what they're saying. So we kind of broke it down. I'm like, okay, so you're having these issues with lateral hip stability, right? You have tight adductors. You have an issue laterally stabilizing the hip in single leg stance. Okay, what could be some of the symptoms that might come from that? Is that you have very tight hip external rotators, or maybe not, maybe tight's not the word, is that you're expressing that as excessive in external rotation through that hip, right? There's maybe a neurological shortening of your hip external rotators. Maybe because of that, you are biasing some sort of anterior tilt, and there is some degree of tibial external rotation because you're using your hamstrings or your biceps femoris to bias hip extension. Okay, so what's the implications there at the foot? Is that you're probably striking the foot with this very externally foot position. You're biasing external rotation through the entire chain. So you're having a hard time producing force and getting into internal rotation of the hip. Okay, cool. We went through and I gave them probably 3 exercises that they could do on the gym floor. You know what? These were the same 3 exercises that foot person told them to do, or very similar to. So it's kind of like you're saying, is that I'm speaking a different language than this person, but when it comes down to, if this is an online client of what they're going to get in their spreadsheet, it's still the same 3 things. And we got there because we applied, maybe they applied different principles. I don't know how they got to what they got to, but the thinking is the same, is that these are the things that we've identified that are an issue in your movement pattern, and we need to correct those. So it's not like we're trying to change. It's not a different outcome. We're just trying to simplify the way that you get there. You don't have to learn a whole new vernacular to come to this conclusion. Is you can just think logically, basing this around some very real principles that you can apply to any part of the body as long as you understand the underlying mechanics, and get to that same principle that this person that talks about feet all day on the internet. So that's an issue in itself, but you can get to that same outcome, and it's going to be the same thing. Is what you see in your spreadsheet is the same 3 exercises, and you're going to have the progress, but you can laterally apply this to anything or anyone, as opposed to just being very niche into that one area.
Yeah. I've learned a lot about a lot from Matt Penny, our CTO. Yeah. So shout out Matt Penny, just a fucking marvel. But learning about computer coding makes me think about exercise programming. Like computer science programming, exercise programming has very similar, there's similar underlying values, and like succinctness and conciseness are, and that's why I choose words that I choose, is because I'd rather use big words in long sentences. That's like an axiom of mine. Like, and I enjoy vocabulary so much because of the human interaction and the experience being so reliant on the nonverbal. Where sometimes, like, I'm the worst, dog, and you know this. You know me better than anyone on this planet. But like, if someone's on some dumb shit, my nonverbals are screaming. Like I will, my ears do this thing. Like when I'm mad, they pin back, and like it's odd. So like my nonverbals I can't control, but my verbals I can control. And it's like, I hate the fact, especially on Instagram, it's like, dog, I got 60 seconds. I can't afford to communicate in long sentences, but I'll use big words, right? So it's like, if you can be succinct in your verbiage and building your model that ultimately makes this decision. And it's so funny that you use the word laterally apply, that this foot guy just has these foot logics that, in this case, when cross applied or filtered or superimposed over, a broader biomechanical understanding of the human body rather than just the mechanics of the foot, you have, and it's so wild because Matt, our CTO at Platform and Prescript, he has a specific way of coding that he calls generics, which generics essentially means that, like, if he writes a tool, he writes it in a way at the core level, the essence of what the tool needs to do and the relationship that tool is going to have with data that it interacts with. I think I did a half decent job at that. So it's not like generic in the sense of like, I'm going to like No Frills and buying the off-brand Cheerios. Like, it's not like generic brand Viagra. It's like generic in the sense that it can be cross-applied in use case after use case after use case. That's another word I learned from that, use case. I use it all the time. There's so many use cases for the word use case. But in looking through understanding like how to program for human movement, there's such a value in being concise, and there's such a value in having a thought process that allows you, just like a line of code, like there's good and bad lines of code. There are codes that are excessively long in length. So a lot of people early on is like, oh, our application has 10,000 lines, 100,000 lines, 200,000 lines, 1,000,000 lines of code. It's like, well, okay, but could that be done in an order of magnitude less? And in a business that's so driven, because we are in the people business, that's so driven by communication, verbal and nonverbal, being able to succinctly come to a conclusion that exacts and produces an exercise faster, that is a better decision faster, that is your value proposition. And then guess what? Then that frees up your time to then be able to communicate rather than being like umming and ahhing. Like your ability to cycle through indexes of exercises and solve problems, right? The more complex problems you can solve and again, I don't mean generic in an off-brand way, right? You're not buying dick pills off the internet. It's like, I mean generic in the sense of that you understand relationships. Like, I think that's, and not like, your relationship with your mother or whatever, like how two things relate to one another. It gets I talk so much in like dumb analogies, but it's because I focus on relationships. Again, not that I don't focus on my relationships with my friends and all that, but I can understand the essence of a relationship, how two things are equal. And then it allows you to jump laterally. Like, I don't know, the number of like Harry Potter references or like desk pop, the other guy's it's all of your, like the ability to speak in analogy and metaphor and simile and all that, it starts with that understanding of how things relate to one another. Because then if you just have an index in your mind of like, here are all the relationships where this object interacts with this object and this is the outcome, then it's like, I don't have to talk about fucking feet. I can talk about Voldemort. And people are like, oh, I get it. I get that. And then it takes that and allows them, because I understand the generic relationship. And I think like in understanding biomechanics, the goal is to find the generic relationships that exist and then be able to just identify when you see them and then have just a quick index that you go into and be like, okay, based off of the magnitude of the manifestation of that relationship, our intervention is going to be somewhere in this general region of exercise. And then you just check to see how they do at that movement. And then you can gauge whether how right your decision was or not based off how good they perform it or don't. So it's like, it's both high level and very granular at the same time. But if there was something that I would focus on across the board in every aspect of your life, is focus on how things relate to one another. Like it's an ever present thing. It's the foundation of causation and versus correlation, and the gradient that's created between the two is understanding and like whether it's inverse relationships, whether it's direct, whether it's positive, whether it's negative, but there's so many different kind of types of relationships. So distilling the essence of how two things interact is the job, and that allows you to go whole circle with it. It allows you to be a better communicator. It builds trust so much faster because it allows you to take action. You're taking responsibility for the decision that's being made. You've actually made a decision, which is better than 98% of people, and you have an ability to adjust and fine tune that decision very quickly based off of a system of generic relationships that you create in your mind around human movement. And then you're Gucci. Like, dog, this is where the money shows up. Like, it's not because you could sit down in a sales room with someone and just be like, all right, like, yeah, what do you got? My knee is this. Okay, I understand how the knee relates to the hip. I understand how the knee relates to the hip and ankle. I understand a certain series of exercises that are rank ordered by complexity or loadability or endurance or intensity or velocity. You pick one. I don't care. Oh, you want to run faster? All right, well, I'll grab that little index from my brain. But here are the knee exercises that we're going to lay out where you're at. And if the person's slow to start, go to the top of the list. Easy as shit. The slowest movements possible. If they're weak, then start at the least loadable movements. If they're strong, have an index for more loadable movements. And if you just sit there and you just Rain Man through lists in your brain like fucking Zach Galifianakis coming down the escalator in the Vegas scene. Like it's all happening in your mind's eye. But it just starts with putting a little bit of front end work. All of this started with a spreadsheet. All this, me and you sitting down, building out spreadsheets. And it's just like, now it's all internalized. And what we internalized was the process of examining relationships. And then when you understand that, then your ability to be confident in the better decisions you're making faster allows you to build on both the accuracy and the quality of your decision, as well as the cadence and the speed by which you make those decisions.
How long were you working as a trainer before this became apparent to you?
I don't know if what I just said was apparent to me up until like 3 weeks ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And That's a very valuable point,
15
because
years?
I mean, I can easily say you're one of the smartest people I know when it comes to biomechanics and training. We'll keep it a little niche there.
We're fucked. Yeah. Well,
But,
Matt Penny does exist, so
Matt, he's just flat out the smartest person I know.
Yeah.
But if this is something it took you, I don't know, 2 decades of training and however long you were training clients for to figure out, and you can just rattle it off like that right now, it makes sense. It's very logical. It's very well founded in experience, well founded in client application, well founded in the research, not to mention you have a doctorate degree. So thinking about that and how well vetted this process is and how long it took to establish this process, imagine if you had this day one of your training career. Imagine where you'd be
cured
at
cancer right now.
Yeah, exactly. It's fucking exactly. So that's kind of what I'm saying, is that understanding this stuff can expedite your career so fucking much. And it's so cool to see when there's, because not everyone fucking gets it. You know, it's information is information, right? This is very finely curated information is what this is. And it's very niche and it's very specific. But there's going to be a very small subset of people that this information resonates with. And it's going to be like introducing fire to a caveman is what it is. It's the world's yours now. Like, I've seen so many people that we've met through Prescript, we've met through the internet and through talking about exercise, that they've gotten a hold of this information and they've made it their own, and it's been an accelerant to their career. And that's the cool part about this shit. And like, even my personal experience is like, I still have a clinical practice. Once I started to understand this stuff and really be able to apply it, I got results so much faster. And that's so much buy-in, that's so much trust, and that's like real world shit. Is like, you're affecting people's lives with this stuff. And that's why this stuff is cool. It's not cool just to like get likes or suck each other's dicks on the internet. It's cool because I don't know, I feel like that's what biomechanics meme pages do.
That's where we're at. Yeah,
exactly. But you're affecting people's lives. Like, I can't tell you how many clients I've had that like they had goals to get out of pain, to go on a hike with their kids, or like play catch with their kid in the yard and shit. Like that's fucking cool. That's way cooler than posting a biomechanics meme on the internet and getting 1,000 likes. Like, it's not about the internet. It's about the shit you do with your clients on the gym floor that affects literally everything else in their life. And that's the cool part of this.
Yeah, and I think what I like that we haven't opted into just automating the whole thing and having it exist on the internet as like an arsenal that someone can go to make a post. And look, I challenge people to do this, and it's something that I heard Neil deGrasse Tyson talk about it on an interview. I don't know, maybe like 6 months ago. The interview was old, but he talked about an interaction he had early in his career, like 25 years ago, where he got interviewed by CNN. And it was like this long, elaborate interview, and he had just gotten the job as the director of the Hayden Planetarium, I think is his title, and he's held that title ever since. And he realized that CNN had only posted up like a very concise soundbite that he had relatively well practiced inadvertently. And, but prior to that, he wasn't like the household name that he is now. But he's leaned in on that angle of like, if you're teaching something, you need to be like probably 10 layers deeper than the level you're teaching at. Right. Mm-hmm. So that's number one, that's big. And that's obviously where he was at. He's talking to CNN. He's not going to go and like full on astrophysics and just lose everyone. But he had a soundbite that went kind of viral before viral was viral. Like, other news stations played it. And then he started to realize like, oh, that's the ticket. Like, so he was speaking in Twitter terms before Twitter existed. And it was just like 140 characters or less. So like, being succinct in your comprehension and delivery of these core principles is so important. And so I don't want to negate the utility of like content creation around certain biomechanical principles, but that to me is usually a part of a process in polishing my delivery for one-to-one, right? Like, there's so many times where like I'll get something the way I want to word it. It's almost like a bit, like a stand-up comedian has a bit. And that's why I love like teaching to audiences, like, as I can work it out in real time. Like, we did 2 weekends in a row and we're going to Thailand this weekend. And it's like, I can work it out on the fly. And then I know like by the time it's a post, it's succinct, because I don't have the nonverbals. I don't have the nonverbals of being in a room with someone when it's on Instagram. So a lot of times the Instagram post is is almost like the end of the road for a soundbite that gets solidified, right? And then it's like when I see the relationship that triggered that the inception of that soundbite's creation, I just refer to that soundbite. And I have different levels of soundbites. Like I have a level that I talk to other physicians or clinicians with. I have a level that I'm talking to someone who has no idea about training. I have a level where we might teach a trainer who knows more than the average person that wants to have a conversation with a clinician or a physician. But it's like, you know, again, it just comes down to communication. And I think that's the number one thing of learning a system of decision making is understanding why you're doing it. And it's right. It's not for the, as you so romantically put it, getting your dick sucked on the internet. It's exactly to do with better communication. Right. So it's like, because people, and it's funny because I see people make posts all the time and they think that my audience is, I don't coach people. Well, I do, but like, I don't get clients from the internet, right? Like I get clients from agents. I get clients from coaches. I get clients from, you know, word of mouth through players that I've worked with. So it's like when I create content and I'll use big words over long sentences, what I'm trying to do is succinctly communicate to those people who are almost at that level, who want to latch onto and climb to this ladder where they can have these more succinct methods of communication to create or to solve more complex problems better and faster. Right. And guess what? Like, because I do get criticized all the time. And it's like, dude, you're not if someone's criticizing me in the way I communicate, it's like, you're not my audience. Right. Because there's a lot of people who are grasping maybe the global concept, or they're missing, and they do need to like look up a word here and there. But guess what? Their vocabulary just expanded. That 7% of their verbal communication just became more succinct and direct. They become better communicators. Like, never in a situation has my vocabulary been my downfall in decisions that actually mattered. Like if I'm in an interview, I sat down with the head of like the neurology department of the Cleveland Clinic, this dude named Jay Alberts, which is like, Cleveland Clinic is probably the number 2 hospital in the US, which puts it, you know, in the running for one of the best hospitals in the world. He was not upset at my level of vocabulary.
Right.
You want to have conversations with idiots on Instagram who put up Twitter posts as reels? Like, go fist yourself. It's like, you got to pay to play, man. And it's like, because you don't understand, like, communications and relationships are the cornerstone of the business that we're in. It's the cornerstone of business, period. And it's like, why would you condemn someone for trying to sharpen one of those 2 tools? Mm-hmm. So it's like, again, if you are like, oh my God, he uses too big of words, it's like, well, maybe you're just retarded. You ever consider that? Maybe you're the problem. But it's like, and I challenge, and that's how the industry gets pushed forward, is people who can just succinctly, it's because it's not jargon. It's a human body. Like, fucking deal with it, man. Like, it's not meant to be, you know, and to steal a Neil deGrasse Tysonism, he talks about the universe, and he's like, the universe is under no obligation to make sense of it. And then to steal a Joe Roganism, we are chimpanzees with universes for brains. So by that cross referencing of those 2 quotes, the human body is of no obligation to make sense to you.
Right. Absolutely.
Right. We have these words because we have more complex relationships, and it's worthwhile. And again, scale your talking points, have your 22, your 45 Magnum, and have your M72 single shot rocket launcher, like different levels that you're communicating to. But like, understand that communication is what builds trust, and trust is a cornerstone of relationships. So you have a very small window to do that in a verbal setting. So choose your words fucking wisely. So it's like, don't say mobility work when you mean stability work. Don't say strength work when you mean stability work. Don't say stability work when you mean strength work. Understand what these things mean and how the meanings are going to change the decisions that you make and the pace by which you make them.
Yeah. Fuck yeah. Absolutely.
That's it. PSL 1 is currently up for sale. Classes start March 22nd, the Wednesday. First lecture, I think we could safely lock it in for 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, with another lecture. This is just for time zone, so it's the same lecture every week. With that, you get the Prescript Level 1 manual. If you're interested in attending live for just a little bit extra, you can do a full weekend seminar plus the course plus the manual, and you get some extra shit when you show up. We have one in Seattle with Luka Hosfazar. I can't Macedonian names. It's hard for me. Former professional ball player, owns a great gym called Vigor Ground. If you're in the Toronto area, we have another one in September That's all up on the website. And stay tuned. This is an exclusive. Dubai will be there in December. So if you're looking to attend an in-person level 1 that also gives you access to the level 1 curriculum online, plus the manual, plus the Prescript Collective, which is, Emerging Ideas lecture series, which is our Discord community channel, which is our bi-weekly technique labs, as well as our other labs, which are open forum discussions, Q&As about the content that you learn. You can go online, www.pre-script.com, and register for the level 1. That's all I wanted to cover today. Was like, God, the language matters, but I think in the essence of relaying the importance of language, a deeper conversation using concise language is only embodying the principle that much more. So that's what this was. Like, the ultimate takeaway is like, think about that. Like, that's really what I kind of put that back of the napkin communication math together in my head the other day. I really felt more vindicated, but also responsible for the words that I say. It's like, you only get, and some people look at that with 7%. Oh, it doesn't matter. It's like, really? That's how you optimize? Is that 7% doesn't matter? Especially this 1% better every day, which if you do the math, even if you're at 0 by April 10th, you'll be a perfect person, because that's the 100th day of the year. But the idea is like, hey, that 7%, that's could be the meaning. In some cases, 7% is the meaning between life and death. Right? Like, if your body temperature increases 7%, you're dead. Yeah. Right? If you go to 106.4 degrees, you're dead. Yeah. Right? Like, if your blood sugar drops precipitously, full circle. These things matter. Right? So, and I think it's something that we have control over, that we don't pay attention to. So know what you mean, say what you mean what you say. Prescript level 1, March 22nd, registration live online, www.pre-script.com. Wrap?
Yeah, man, that's great. I think even that is
sick.
Like a principle in general, is the shit you're doing matters. Like, take it to a client. You have 60 minutes with a client twice a week. Like, every second matters. So making those decisions, better decisions, faster, it fucking matters. So That's just a good one to wrap it on. I look forward to seeing you guys in person at the level 1s, online. Can't wait to hang.
Dope.